The Locked On Podcast Network presents the NFL Big 3 in 30. The 3 biggest stories in the NFL from our local experts at the Locked On Podcast Network. We bring you the real story, why it matters, what's next, who wins the big game, and more, all in 30 minutes. The NFL Big 3 in 30 starts now with the biggest story in the NFL.
San Francisco 49ers making moves for another pass rusher. Does this complete the unit up front for the 2025 team?
You are Locked On 49ers, your daily San Francisco 49ers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
As we go through the offseason here and big moves the 49ers are making here over the weekend, getting ready for the 2025 season. And Croc, that means 49ers might have a little bit more sack production this year, depending on which Bryce Huff they get. And according to Adam Schefter, Bryce Huff is on his way to the San Francisco 49ers and the Philadelphia Eagles, who he spent last season with, even though he was not a big factor for that team, Croc, are paying a lot of his salary, and the 49ers are going to give up a mid-round pick to pay him a little bit less than whatever salary he was going to be making this year. According to ESPN sources, 49ers and Eagles are working to finalize a trade that will send edge rusher Bryce Huff to the San Francisco 49ers for a mid-round pick. The trade cannot and would not be processed until after June 1st, which is today. And both sides are working to make it happen, and Huff already has reworked his contract to help facilitate the trade. In San Francisco, Huff will be reunited with 49ers defensive coordinator Robert Saleh, his former head coach with the Jets. So many former Jets now being added to the 2025 San Francisco 49ers. Just last week, another defensive player, linebacker Chaz Surratt, was added by the 49ers, and they cut Mitch Wishnowsky, the punter, to bring in 39-year-old former Jets punter Thomas Morstead, too. So there's going to be a lot of familiar faces for Robert Saleh here from both his days with the 49ers and his days with the Jets as they get things going with the 2025 San Francisco 49ers. What are your thoughts here, Croc, initially of the addition of edge rusher Bryce Huff to the San Francisco 49ers?
I'm gonna be honest, man. I pride myself on watching a lot of football. Really, whatever game is on TV, I usually have it on, and I have multiple TVs in my office, so I'm watching a lot of different games. Got Red Zone on. I did not know who Bryce Huff was. And I don't know how or why I didn't know, but the 49ers got him, and I saw 49ers added Bryce Huff. I didn't know how they added him. I thought okay, here's a free agent edge rusher that was just available at the moment. Then you start kind of looking a little deeper. You're like, 49ers traded for him. 49ers potentially traded a mid-round pick for him. A year ago, he had 10 sacks in the season. That number went down with Philadelphia to 2. Then you start to dive into, how could that happen? And start looking at, under Robert Saleh and whatever defense Robert Saleh had him playing in, he excelled, played well, and had a 10-sack production. Right now, people get 10 sacks different. Leonard Floyd, what did he have, 10 sacks last year, and nobody really said anything about it. However many sacks he had, close to 10, whatever it was. So there could be kind of a quiet double-digit sack, or it could be loud. And I'm not sure which one his was, but I do know this. You can have 10 sacks with the New York Jets under Robert Saleh, and you fit that defensive scheme. If you can go somewhere else and they want to pay you a bunch of money, but you don't quite fit what this defensive coordinator would happen to be, Vic Fangio, maybe it wasn't a great marriage between those two. So there's a lot of people putting in stock, especially Philadelphia Eagle fans. 49ers got fleeced. All right, we'll see. But I'll take my chances on the guy who played under Robert Saleh and now is reunited with him. And I think it just helps the 49ers defensively because you had a lot of youth. You added a lot of youth that was really right now ready to stop the run. And we talked about developing as a pass rusher. But now you went and got a guy that has proven with productivity that, I can get to the quarterback. So this is something, the more I looked into it, the more I really liked.
Bryce Huff, draft pick out of Memphis, 6'3", 255 pounds. And he he's bounced around a little bit already in his career and has been sort of a athletic outside speed type of a rusher. And his career with the New York Jets, 4 years, he had a nice 10 sack season in 2023, and that's the thing that got him paid by the Philadelphia Eagles. So 10 sacks was his, by far, I mean, it more than doubled his sack production from any other year in his career. In fact, he had exactly 10 sacks combined his first 3 years in the league, 2020, 2021, and 2022 with the New York Jets. 2023, his final year with the Jets under Robert Saleh. He had a 10 sack season that year, and then just was not the same guy. That just did not have the same production. Blame it on whatever. And there's some very low light, I don't know what you call it, low light packages out there with him not looking great with the Philadelphia Eagles last year. And Philadelphia Eagles fans, Croc, are excited, and they're dancing in the streets thinking that the 49ers overpaid by giving up anything for a guy that they just wanted gone and thought he might just get completely cut because he was such a non-factor for the Philadelphia Eagles last year. He had 2 sacks, was not even active for the Super Bowl, just a player that they brought in to provide something, and it ended up being some, other draft picks and other internal players that ended up being the guys that the Philadelphia Eagles leaned on for that extra pass rush. Guys like Jalix Hunt, who was a former safety, small school college guy, super athletic, ended up kind of playing some of the role of Bryce Huff, and Nolan Smith out of Georgia as well. And so they got the production they needed without Bryce Huff. So he was clearly expendable by the Philadelphia Eagles, and for whatever reason was just not a factor at all last year. And so the question becomes, are you getting the 2 sack guy? Are you getting the 4 sack guy? Or are you getting his most recent season with Robert Saleh from 2023 with the New York Jets? Are you going to get that 10 sack guy that can be a rotational nightmare? Because, Croc, we talked about it. I was on the air on Thursday with Jason Aponte on the OT with BP channel, and we were talking about this very subject. The 49ers had to add another pass rush piece to the plan. It was clearly not a unit that was finished yet, and this looks like that piece. Bryce Huff now joining the San Francisco 49ers. I'm kind of in the middle on this one, Croc, because I think there's some 49ers fans that are really excited about it because, okay, good, got the pass rusher because the Niners draft picks were more run defenders than pass rushers, and the 49ers need somebody who can provide some rush, on those 3rd and long situations, and I totally agree with that. I don't think Bryce Huff has a track record in the NFL of being such a slant. Like, you're not getting, it's not like the Rams getting Von Miller, right? Like, you hope you get the 10 sack guy, but it's possible that maybe he's more like what we saw with the Eagles or more like what we saw earlier in his career with the Jets than getting, double digit sacks for the 49ers. And then on the other side of that, there's Philadelphia Eagles saying that they fleeced fans and some media saying that the Eagles fleeced the 49ers because they gave up anything at all of value for a completely sunk cost, completely worthless player that the Eagles did not want. And we'll see what exactly the restructured contract looks like and exactly what pick that ends up being for the 49ers going to the Philadelphia Eagles. But if it's a later round pick, I think mid-round is the way it was phrased. If it's a later mid-round pick, if we're talking more 5, 6, something like that, and the 49ers don't have to pick up a lot of salary, then yeah. But if the 49ers gave up a lot, then you might still have given up something of value for a guy who ends up being that 2 to 4 sack guy who he's been for most of his career.
Yeah, you look at the numbers, and that definitely paints a different picture than the double-digit sack season, the one double-digit sack season that he had. Not having over 4 sacks, or excuse me, over 3.5 sacks in any other season, I think is a little questionable. Being a guy, especially if he was healthy for the Philadelphia Eagles, who really pride themselves on winning up front, getting after the quarterback, 2.5 sacks, only played in 12 games. I like the potential of the move in that he has shown that he can be productive, but which version of him are you getting? And right now, if I had to just, if I'm a gambling man, which I can be, all right, if I'm gambling man, if they set the over under on the sacks at 3.5, it would be hard not to take the under.
I'd take the over on 3.5, but if you're expecting 10, I would take the under just because we don't know exactly what he's going to be. We don't know how much he's going to see the field, but it was clearly a need for the 49ers, and they have addressed that need.
Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so stop just managing your money and start building wealth. Instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan long-term goals. Managing money with your partner is smoother than ever. You can track shared and personal accounts, set goals, and stay on the same page without the stress. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year.
Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton is walking around this offseason with a little bit of swagger.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast.
Week 2 of OTAs. Yes, the Broncos back on the field here once again this week. We got to see them last week, but there's some storylines that are brewing as we get ready for the second week of OTAs. And more importantly, there's a newfound confidence. There's this calmness that we're seeing with Broncos head coach Sean Payton. And we'll tell you why he believes that he can win with this team here in 2025. We'll also go through why the Broncos are in a better position to win more games this season, because they have retained the most players on their roster over any team over the last year. And then we're also going to look ahead at some of the key storylines here for week 2 of Broncos OTAs. You're going to get all that on Locked On Broncos. So with that said, Sarah, let's kick it off here. This is my third year covering Sean Payton, right? And in the first 2 years, I think year number 1, what did he tell us just a year ago during OTAs? He said, last year was, in his first year, he's referencing his first year, was more so of marking, lifting the leg on, a few trees right there. That's what he had told us, because he's coming into a situation that was just, I don't even know what the word is to describe it. Unconventional. There was a culture that was going on here with the Nathaniel Hackett era, with everything that was going on in the locker room that was just different than what Sean Payton has ever been accustomed to. So he had to come in with an iron fist. He did that. We've seen iron fist Sean Payton the last 2 years, and there's been some moments where it's like, oh, Sean's laid back. Now, walking around Broncos OTAs, the one thing I'll say, Sarah, Sean has this newfound level of confidence. He's got this grin where he just is seemingly happy. Like he feels like deep down, I think there's something special brewing with this team. And there's obviously going to be a lot of time between now and the regular season where he wants to get as much of that out as possible to where it can lead to on-field success for the Broncos. But having an ultra confident head coach is a game changer, I believe.
It really is, because he's just operating in a different realm, right? I mean, you mentioned when he came to Denver in 2023, it was the peeing on fire hydrants and really trying to instill a culture that is a winning culture, as opposed to a culture that had kind of gotten used to losing, unfortunately. Not that anybody previously wanted to lose in Denver, but you kind of get used to that, and you kind of get used to being the team that loses. And so you need somebody to come in and kind of just harshly change that. And that's what Sean Payton did, getting this team back to the playoffs last year. And I know that Sean is a big proponent of saying we don't build off of last year. You start with a clean slate. It's like resetting the game board in the NFL. But I can't help but think there's a little bit of him, Cody, that, even though he's going to continue to preach what he believes in that you don't build off last year, I can't help but feel like there's a little part of him that really believes that they can build off of what they did last year and not just starting from scratch. Now, yes, you want to take the mentality of, hey, we're starting from ground zero. We're not starting off this year with 10 wins. You do want to take that mentality on, but in terms of where players were developing late last season, in terms of where Bo Nix was at over the course of last year, I know that Sean, even if it's not building off last year, you want to hit the ground running. And man, I can't help but think, after just seeing the footage that you posted out there, the pictures of him at OTAs, you can't help but feel like, man, he does feel like this team is hitting the ground running already in 2025.
Yeah, I would say there's less like stop and walk and talk and teach, at OTAs in comparison to years past. And look, I understand we're probably going to get people to say, guys, it's OTAs, relax. We're not trying to get overly excited about anything. I'm just telling you, as somebody who has been around Sean Payton for the last 3 years, there's an evident difference with his demeanor right now than there was at this time last year or even in his first year. A stark difference. He's a 360 night and day different person. We went from, what was it, in 2023, we went from Latte Gate to now all of a sudden Sean Payton he's got zen. Like, remember there were stories coming out about how he had like candles in his office to try to relax. Like, this is a guy who's just so wound up tight that he just needed to find ways to relax and decrease his stress. Sean Payton doesn't look any bit stressed there. And look, I think even last year with how in the offseason, the outlook there of trying to navigate what was the Russell Wilson situation. Okay, we moved on from him. You take on the massive dead cap. The Broncos acknowledged it after the regular season with George Payton that, we knew we had to embrace having a young roster this upcoming, this season in 2024. And then now we're in a place where we're flexible. Now, obviously, I agree with your analogy, and Sean is very much on board with saying, what we did last year doesn't matter. But I think foundationally, when you look at like how you build your roster, the pieces you have in place, that is important, right? And that's going to lead into obviously our conversation coming up here in a little bit about continuity. But here's the foundation, Sarah. You have your quarterback, you have cornerstone players, you have Patrick Surtain II. You have guys like Zach Allen. You've got emerging guys who are going to be cornerstone guys like Nick Bonito here. And you mentioned as well about the culture and about where everything was at. I also think Nick Bonito's comments, even just last year, I think were very telling. Because remember, he jumped on the Pivot podcast with Channing Crowder, Fred Taylor, and Ryan Clark. And the one thing he said was, my rookie year, we're coming in. And he said, guys are like in the huddle going 1, 2, 3 Cancun, like we're ready for the offseason. He says that was a shock to me. Those guys are not in the locker room anymore, right? Like they have completely changed that around. And one thing that Nick Bonito said is it's because of how Sean is. Like, it's not easy, but it's worth it. And I would say that's the common message. You talk to guys like Zach Allen, who also went on a podcast to talk about Sean Payton. Sean Payton is a guy that I think we know goes to war for his players, and he's hard on his players. And look, during times where there's ups and downs, and let's say you're on the downward slope of it, Sean Payton's message can be a little hard and can be frustrating sometimes if you're a player. But on the other side of it, you've seen the reward. Like, hey, there's a reason we're going through this. And I always go through, like, do you remember Hard Knocks? Dan Campbell's first, something along the lines, whenever the Lions were on it, where they were going through physical contact. And he's like, guys, I know you don't like this, but he says, trust me, I see this. Like, there's a reason for it. That's the same exact way that Sean Payton is kind of going about this whole culture change in the Mile High City. Now, Sean's got his guys that he believes are leaders that they've brought in, that they've drafted, guys that can be homegrown guys that are now emerging as leaders for this team. That sets the foundation, and that makes it easier for Sean and the coaching staff to not have to worry about having to do everything themselves. The coaches, they're a branch of the players. The coaches set the standard. The players got to carry that forward. I think that's been very evident from the changes that we've seen here in Dove Valley.
That's such a key thing that you just brought up about the homegrown guys, because in Sean's first year in Denver, there's a lot of holdovers, right? You're inheriting a roster. And then kind of in, between year 1 and year 2, you're bringing in, what we've called your guys or Sean Payton's guys, right? To bring those guys in and say, hey, this player knows exactly what Sean Payton expects. They know how to operate within the offense. They know the roles, but they might not be as talented as some of the other guys that you've drafted to potentially play those roles in the future. Now in year 3, you kind of get the impression that, as you and I were talking in a previous episode of the show, Cody, about how Sean kind of feels like he's going to be able to mix and match pieces all over this offense and really keep defenses on their heels with his personnel groupings. It feels so much different now than it did 2 years ago or even a year ago, when he's having to throw guys out there into the offense who they just know the roles, right? They just know what position, like they know the position, they know what they're expected to do. And now it's a perfect marriage of, I think, that homegrown talent, the talent that's actually better than what's been there in the past, and Sean being able to just say, all right, I can call the plays and I don't have to do as much, like you said, teaching and I can start to scheme a little bit more. He's got his scheming mask on, doesn't he? He's not just out there with the teacher hat and saying like, all right, I got to actually like come out here and show you what to do or tell you what to do or make sure we repeat this process because you made a mistake on it one too many times. Now he's out there, he's got his bag of plays, he's got his bag of tricks, and he's kind of just pulling stuff out and being like, ooh, yeah, let's see how this goes, because now the players out there, they're now it's a combination of talent plus his guys, and they're going to be able to execute at a much higher level. I think it's going to be a stark day-night type difference for Broncos country, seeing how this team operates with a new level of talent on the roster.
Well, speaking of his guys, there's a reason why Sean Payton is excited, and that's because the Broncos roster has continuity all across the board.
The NBA playoffs roll on, and FanDuel is giving new customers an incredible way to get in on the action. Right now, when you join FanDuel and you place your first $5 bet, you'll get $250 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. FanDuel makes betting easy, whether it's picking your favorites or diving into player props, from three-pointers to steals to assists. There's so many ways to bet your favorite player props. Plus, after the game tips off, you can even combine live prop bets into a same-game parlay for a chance to win big. Don't miss out. Head to FanDuel.com and claim your $250 in bonus bets today.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We're talking all about Kyle Pitts, and this comes from, a tweet from Jordan Schultz, NFL insider, on Friday, in which he said, sources, multiple teams have reached out to the Falcons about the availability of tight end Kyle Pitts. Nothing is imminent. Atlanta would prefer to keep him, but I'm told it would take at least a day 2 pick to even spark serious talks. So shout out to Jordan Schultz for talking about a thing that we've been talking about. Well, we haven't been talking about it for the last 3 or 4 months, but we're talking about 3 or 4 months ago. This isn't new information, guys. Don't sit here and act like this. Don't be brand new and act like this is new information. It's like, oh, well, Kyle Pitts trade is imminent. No. This has been the same situation that we spent most of January and February talking about. We talked about then how the Falcons were likely looking for hopefully a 3rd round pick to get Kyle Pitts, right? It's just the reason why are they talking about it now, right? It's because there's nothing else to talk about. Right, you go watch these, NFL Network and whatnot. They're talking about who showed up for voluntary workouts and who didn't show up for, and what does it mean, and all this. Like, they have literally nothing else to talk about. And so, with the Jonnu Smith trade rumor coming around, I'm sure the Jordan Schultzes of the world were reaching out to their various sources and being like, who else could be available? And it's like, oh, Kyle Pitts might be available. Speaking of tight ends, and it's like, yeah, Kyle Pitts has been available for 4 months. This ain't nothing new. So, we talked about it back then, 4 months ago. And we talked about the potential for Kyle Pitts having a robust trade market back in early February or mid to late February before the combine, in contrast to what one of our guests, Josh Kendall of The Athletic, said, where he didn't think there was going to be much of a trade market. Josh was once again right on that one, while I was wrong on that one. And basically the idea back then was, hey, for one of these teams that's not going to get Colston Loveland in round 1 or Tyler Warren in round 1, maybe they'll circle back and say, hey, let's get Kyle Pitts, right, in a contract year. And that didn't quite work out. And I think one of the reasons why we haven't talked about Kyle Pitts really since that, February 22nd or whenever that episode was when we talked about his trade market, was because the trade market changed, right? At that time, it seemed like Kyle Pitts was going to be the prize. But then we found out during Combine Week that the Raiders are also shopping Michael Mayer, right? We found out during free agency that the Eagles were open for people to trade for Dallas Goedert. And now you have this past week, Jonnu Smith reports about him potentially being on the trade block. And so essentially we needed scarcity when it came to the tight end market for someone to come in and give up the price that the Falcons were looking for back then, which again, we thought was a 3rd round pick, and what Jordan Schultz and everybody else is saying, suggesting a similar sort of price tag, right? Unfortunately, there's too much supply when it comes to the tight ends this offseason and just not enough demand. And that's not likely to change in the coming months. And so that's why I continue to say, hey guys, don't sit here and think something new is happening, something brand new. The wheels are moving, right? Again, I'm not going to get into it on today's episode, but one of my biggest frustrations with social media when it comes to coverage of this team and how fans react to what they see on social media is that they overreact to the most recent piece of information that they did and somehow think, hey, a Kyle Pitts trade is imminent now because Jordan Schultz tweeted about it, and that's the most recent tweet about the Falcons from an NFL insider, even though nothing has changed in 4 months. But we will see if something changes over the next 4 months, right, over the summer, or as we push towards the trade deadline, which is on November 4th this year, that, similar to Kirk Cousins, maybe there's an injury that will force a team to up their offer, up that demand for a tight end like Kyle Pitts. Maybe the Falcons come down on their demands in the lead up to the trade deadline, or a team is willing to go up their demands in the lead up to that November 4th trade deadline. We'll have to sort of see, but there's really no reason to sort of speculate on a Kyle Pitts trade today any more than you have been speculating about a Kyle Pitts trade 3-4 months ago. And there's less reason now, frankly, because the market has kind of dictated to you that teams aren't willing to meet the various prices that teams are looking for. Other teams, including the Falcons, are looking for. So there's less reason to speculate on a Kyle Pitts trade. And so unless something changes in that regard, and there's only a handful of teams that I think would even seriously consider Kyle Pitts at this stage in the offseason, as opposed to where we were in February before any moves were made, it's basically like Tennessee and maybe Dallas, in my humble opinion, that would actually be willing to overpay for a player like Kyle Pitts. But we will see on that front. But when we talk about what could change for Kyle Pitts, the focus is not on a trade. The focus is on, can the Falcons get more out of Kyle Pitts this upcoming season? Because frankly, I don't think this team makes the playoffs if they don't get more out of Kyle Pitts than they got a year ago. So Kyle Pitts is a necessary component of this Falcons offense, because we just look back through that 6 week span from week 5 to week 10, where the Falcons were tied for the second most explosive plays in the NFL during that 6-game stretch behind Baltimore. They were tied with Washington in second place, generating 30 explosive plays over those 6 weeks. And that was also, not coincidentally, the best stretch of the season from a record standpoint, and their best stretch of the season when it came to scoring points, right? Those two things are related. Like, the more points you score, the more chances, the higher your probability of winning games, especially when you're dealing with the Atlanta Falcons defense, because Lord knows we are not winning 17-14 games like that. But it's not a coincidence that during that 6-game stretch, that was also the stretch of games where Kyle Pitts was also most involved in the offense. He accounted for 17% of those explosive plays that they had during that stretch. The rest of the season, it was 5% of the Falcons' explosive plays, right? You also look at how many targets he was getting during that stretch of the season. 15.8% of the Falcons' passing attempts went to Kyle Pitts. The rest of the year, that was 11.7%. And you compare that. I went and looked up the top 33 tight ends in the NFL last year in terms of target share. All the guys that had 49 or more targets last year, 33 of him. And that 15.8% that Kyle Pitts had during that 6-game stretch would have ranked 16th in the NFL, right behind Sam Laporta at 16.8% and right ahead of Pat Freiermuth at 15.6%. So smack dab in the middle among those top 33 tight ends. And then you compare that to the 11.7% target share that he had for the rest of the season outside of that 6-game stretch. That would have ranked 28th in the NFL among the 33 tight ends, just behind Jawan Johnson's 12% and just ahead of Austin Hooper's 11.1%. And the interesting thing about those two guys is those two guys were technically the number 2 tight end in a 2 tight end offense. That Johnson was the pass catcher in his duo with Foster Moreau in New Orleans, and Austin Hooper was more of the blocker, with Hunter Henry being the pass catcher in that duo. And so, that's kind of telling you that Kyle Pitts was basically being used like a number 2 tight end would be used in an offense that wasn't using 2 tight ends, which is what the Falcons were not, an offense that used 2 tight ends all that often outside of 3 games last year, right? And so for me, basically what I'm sitting here saying is that 15.8% that we saw during that 6-game stretch where this Falcons offense was humming, they were explosive, they were winning games. That was the stretch of games that was during the month of October, right? That should be the norm throughout the entire season. We should get that for at least an entire season. At least 16% of the Falcons targets are going to Kyle Pitts. Again, that's down from what it was in the Arthur Smith years when that number was in the 20 percentile. No one's pushing for that. Right? No one's expecting Kyle Pitts to be the featured weapon in the offense like he was during those Arthur Smith years, right? And that's what 16% of the targets could potentially be. And so, when we translate what 16% of the targets could be in this version of the Falcons offense, right? And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago in sort of talking about, Kirk Cousins was on pace for like 570 targets last year had he not been benched. And so if we just assume Michael Penix is going to throw the ball just as much, 570 targets, about 16% of 570 targets would be about 91 targets for Kyle Pitts, right? He had 74 last year. That's 17 more targets this year. That's one more target per game, and that's a healthy number for Kyle Pitts. We're not talking about some huge chunk of the offense that the Falcons have to carve out for Kyle Pitts in order to get to an acceptable number, right? Like the fact that you can't come up with one more target, scheme up one more target for Kyle Pitts. I mean, it could be as easy as a screen pass, which the Falcons ran 0 tight end screens last year. They were the only team in the NFL that did not run a single tight end screen last year. And I bring that up because, the Falcons like to zig when other teams like to zag. And oftentimes the way that the Falcons zig doesn't make a ton of sense when it comes to like, why are you the only team that's not running a tight end screens last year? But, we know that Kyle Pitts is not going to be the featured weapon in this offense, right? We know that when defensive coordinators are looking at this Falcons offense, they're looking at the big three in terms of what are the priorities, in terms of what they're game planning to be, right? Bijan Robinson in the run game is number 1. Drake London is number 2 as their Falcons number 1 wide receiver, and Darnell Mooney is number 3 as their number 2 wide receiver. Basically, what I'm sitting here saying, guys, is Kyle Pitts should be the fourth option, right? It should be a big 3 plus Kyle Pitts, right? I'm not even going to say a big 4. I'm just saying a big 3 plus Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts should be number 4. Unfortunately, too often, Ray McCloud has been the number 4 guy in the offense. And to me, that's making it too easy on defensive coordinators, right? That they don't have to spend here devoting really much of any time during the week game plan trying to figure out how we stop this 6'6", 240-pound tight end with 4.4 speed. Instead, they're like, oh, how do we stop this 5'9", 190-pound wide receiver with 4.4 speed that basically is ideally a number 4 wide receiver, not a number 3 wide receiver? You're just making it easier on defensive coordinators. You're challenging defenses if you can find ways to make Kyle Pitts at least a feature weapon. It's about the idea when we talk about Michael Penix and his arm talent. It's forcing defenses to defend every blade of grass. It is much harder to defend the entire field and all of the Falcons receivers than it is to just defend 2 of them, right? Which is too often the case with the Atlanta Falcons last year, and due to the limited arm strength of the former quarterback and whatnot. And so basically what I'm sitting here asking is Kyle Pitts just needs to be your trump card,